The wonderful Sara Evans Barker. Can you imagine? Dan Evans is here. We are the two women on the IU Health Board. This man is a saint and a visionary, I must admit, to have both of us on that board. Sara herself, as many of you know, was Indiana's first woman federal judge. Last year, she was made a living legend by the Indiana Historical Society. And just in the last 2 months, she was selected by Modern Healthcare as Trustee of the Year nationally for all the service that she's done, first at Methodist Hospital, then at Clarion, and now at IU Health. And so a round of applause for a wonderful... You know, I'm really honored. Dr. Robert Enters in medicine and Dr. Jan Ships from liberal arts were the first two people to, in fact, give this lecture, and to be in their company is very special. I want over the time together, and you're going to get a neck ache with this here. Particularly those of you in the front seats. But I want to go back to ponder. The one thing this kind of a lecture can do is it gives you an opportunity to look back and to consider the dreams of childhood compared to current realities. I do want to share with you a little bit about my own background, and my focus is on leadership, so I want to talk about my own love-hate relationship with leadership, lessons learned along the way, and then really it only works to look back if, in fact, you use the looking back to move forward. Judge Barker talked about Randy Pausch's lecture, and many of you have either read the book or have gone on YouTube and seen the lecture. But he particularly focuses on you don't have to have a long life to achieve your childhood dreams. So his whole focus is on achieving childhood dreams. I am different from him. I didn't have that many childhood dreams. If you were a girl growing up in the 1940s and the 1950s, and you read Erik Erikson on ego development, he said you weren't even supposed to finalize who you were until you found the man that you would marry and had the children that you would have. So it was much more a message in the 40s and 50s of keep yourself open, don't have your own personal dreams. If you think about that, that's an enormously responsive posture rather than a leadership stance. And it resonates with when I said to both of my parents that I wanted to become a nurse. My mother said something about, well, you can always use that psychology on your kids. So the idea of becoming a nurse was it would be good preparation for what would be your real career, which was to get married and have children. My father, in his own pithy way, actually said, good. You can always fall back on nursing in case you marry a drunkard. Now, you have to understand that I grew up in East Baltimore, which was, Baltimore has always been like Chicago with a lot of ethnic enclaves and a lot of saloons that sell good crab cakes on the corners. So the notion that nursing was a fallback position in case he turned out to be a jerk it made sense to me. It was part of the world that I grew up in. Again, all I can say is this is not a destiny for leadership. As I talk about my journey, I thought I would do two things in this picture. prove to some people that I actually did wear a cap at one point. I always, since even after many years in academia, I still had children who said to me, "Did you ever used to be a real nurse?" So I would like to point out, 62, by this time I already had a bachelor's degree. I was at Yale, and I had just started I was working on a master's degree and doing research. And actually, this was a picture taken as part of the clinical research that I was doing then. Go to now, and the other picture is, there is an oil painting. All of the deans of IU School of Nursing have oil paintings, and I swear the painting has eyes that keep shifting as you walk by. But this is, in fact, my journey. My background was about as traditional as it could be. My mother was a seamstress. My father was a policeman. They were very much in their own belief system, and if you think about the times, it was a period where people were talking about he's the head and she's the heart, so the notion that somehow you had opposites coming together. The two of them really believed in education, though, as the key to success. And I have to tell you, I maximized all my acting out behaviors through education. You couldn't really leave home in my community. If you grew up in that really very religious, very traditional community, the only excuse you had for leaving home was a good education. And so, in fact, I did maximize that. I would say there were hints of leadership about me. I actually was the first girl to be president of our parish's Catholic youth organization. I was the editor of the literary journal in my high school. But I have to tell you that doing those things, if somebody had said you're a leader, I would have looked around and said glibly that you all are in trouble if I am your leader. I began to change when I went to Yale for a master's degree. And because Yale University had a very long tradition, and I got there in 1962, of leadership, even at the School of Nursing, instead of, as so many other places do, are you really good enough to be here? Yale didn't have that kind of a feeling. What Yale did when I got there was to assume that if you got into Yale, you were talented. And so the whole issue is, what are you going to do with your gifts? And people would talk that way about what are you going to do. I can't overestimate how important that is, because people believing in what you're going to do gets you away from looking at your belly button. If they're always testing you, you keep looking at yourself to see whether you're adequate. If they talk about what are you going to do, you're looking at the horizon. I was enormously conflicted about leadership. The issue for my generation was not, do you have a career? It was, do you work outside the home after you have children? So it was essentially a piece of time where the issue was, do you have a job? You know, nobody even thought in terms of a career. When Bill and I were married, and he was teaching in the philosophy department at Yale, believe it or not, the philosophy ladies, and of course these were all the spouses because there were women philosophers were not to be found, had monthly lunches. And I actually worked part-time when my first child was born, and they told me they were concerned about me. Well, as well as Sara would say, they were right. They understood at the beginning. So it was not a climate where even if you worked outside the home that you got much support. In fact, it was a period where If Bill traveled, nobody invited me out, but if I ever went anywhere, they kept worrying that maybe our children would be lost, and he would get invited to dinners. I mean, this is, relatively early in the women's movement, so this is the 60s. I was educated to be a caregiver, so I didn't then associate what was my skill set with leadership. I knew I was good at facilitating and supporting and responding and educating and organizing. But at that time, we were not talking that much about those qualities being leadership. In fact, at that time, if you read the leadership literature, you would have had leadership described as being self-confident, dominant, powerful, in control. Those were the notions of leadership at the time. The second wave of the women's movement didn't do all that much for me. Meaning, if you think about suffrage as the first wave of the women's movement, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, really urged entry into the domains of men. And I would argue, looking back, one of the things that then happened in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s was that message then inadvertently devalued the traditional domains of women. What you got enormously during those period of time was you're smart, you could have been a doctor, you didn't have to be a nurse. And even to the point when I was on the Women's Fund board for our Women's Fund in Indianapolis, they put me on a committee for a brochure for girls. And they actually, in one draft, talked about all that girls could do in becoming an engineer and going into information science. And in parentheses, it said, you don't have to be just a nurse or a teacher. This is Women's Fund. And in fact, of course, I said, and you wonder why you don't have good teachers and nurses? This kind of language then just devalues. So what happens is if that's the societal noise, you then are conflicted about your own leadership. And in fact, if any of you have read the classic article by Clance and Imes, and I only read it well after it was out, it's a classic in the women's literature on the imposter phenomenon, because it talked very much about how women often, when they even are in leadership positions, see, if you grow up where you have to be twice as good to be any good, then you're always worried that you're going to be found out, that you're not perfect. And there really is, to this day, though it's changing enormously, more of a difference. I think men look at the same opportunity and they don't think they'll be perfect in taking the next job. They think that job will help them get to where they're going next. Women look at the same job, and if they know that they can't do it immediately, they worry about whether they will be adequate. It isn't that they're inadequate. They expect often in their own scripts perfection to begin with. So when in fact you're struggling with the imposter phenomenon, then you are conflicted about leadership. There were some turning points in my own life. And I have to say, first and foremost, Bill and I were married in 1965. I never really understood when we were married how important it was that his mother had been Phi Beta Kappa in 1917. This actually was to my benefit because his notion of bright women wasn't necessarily my traditional notion. And so I married someone who, in addition to handing me a cup of coffee in the morning, since I am not a morning person, the other good thing that he has done for me for 46 years is he has regularly asked me, what do you want to do next? Even when I didn't think that was an appropriate question. I mean, if you have a young child and somebody says to you, what do you want to do next? Especially when the scenario in your head is, I want to be to my child what my mother was to me. You don't necessarily come up with a career goal. However, I did notice that every time he asked me what I wanted to do next, I had an answer. And I actually, particularly early on, had answers that surprised me that I had them. So that experience was enormously important in my own growth and development. Sara alludes to the fact, I wrote what was the first well-regarded book to look at motherhood in light of the women's movement. It was reviewed by the New York Times 3 weeks after being out and had a glowing review. I have to tell you, it has been downhill ever since in my reviews. Writing that book, which did not start out as a book, I just had thoughts that were different from what was the literature at the time. And the literature at the time was what the good mother does for the sake of the child, not reflecting on parenting as a stage of adult development. And if you think back, we only really had a literature on adult development at the late 70s and 80s. So this was actually one of the first books to actually talk about parenting as adult development. What it required of me, though, was to write when I was tortured at the time with the notion of if it was any good, it would already be written. Just think about that one. If in your head you say to yourself as a mark of whether something is good, if it was really this hot stuff, it would already exist. Well, of course, if you really think that way perpetually, you never do a creative thing in your life because you never go out of the box. And what that book's success did for me, and it really was a success, it was at the top of Harper and Rowe's list for part of that summer, was to give me some confidence to take my ideas seriously. And if you grew up as I did, where you didn't really necessarily expect girls to have dreams, to begin to take your ideas seriously as something maybe to move forward was a very important thing. And then, I don't know how many of you remember, but the W.K. Kellogg Foundation actually had, for quite a number of years, a National Kellogg Fellowship Program, which was geared towards leadership development. And I was in the second cohort. It was an interdisciplinary group. In fact, my group was 40 of us fellows. Of the 40, only 9 were women. And of the 9 who were women, I was the only traditional woman, meaning by that, married to the original husband and having children. But what happened is the Kellogg Foundation believed, and I was the first nurse to be in that leadership was interdisciplinary, that you could not have any one discipline be in charge of leadership, that leadership was interdisciplinary. And in fact, working with others, it was, if I ever had to completely exercise from my brain the notion that I was smart for a nurse, it happened there, because I wound up in managing the last seminar. And within that group of people, winding up being somebody who was really very active within this group. I've then gone on to be a leader. Having been tortured about leadership, I have been in a number of positions. This is not meant to recapitulate my CV, but it's meant to say that I, like many people in a practice profession, started out with clinical responsibilities. I then, as an academic leader, have been a department chair. I was the first associate dean for research at the School of Nursing, then the dean of the School of Nursing. I've been president of 2 organizations. One of them is Sigma Theta Tau International, and the current executive director here. Opposite the Madam Walker building is that lovely building with columns. I was president during the period that was created. And then I have gone from discipline-specific leadership to interdisciplinary boards. I've been on the, and these are just a few of NIH kinds of interdisciplinary boards. And in fact, one I am enormously proud of to be on is the one for Indiana University Health. During this time, I have thought a great deal about leadership. If you didn't grow up to be a leader, and in fact you wind up being in a leadership program, and then you work with others to try to help them develop their own leadership, I've thought an enormously large amount about leadership. And for me, leadership is a process whereby the leader, and it can either be someone who is formally designated the leader or an emergent leader, winds up inspiring and catalyzing others to achieve shared values and institutional mission in an environment where the context and the very meanings keep evolving. So you always have to design new ways of doing things. And for my field, the fact that the meanings of health and aging keep evolving have been very important. I want to be very clear that my view of leadership has nothing to do with administrative title. Or to put it another way, you hope people who have an administrative title are incapable of leadership, but you don't have to have an administrative title to exert leadership. And it's a view of leadership that ranges from individual performance and productive teamwork to inspiring higher performance in others and creating enduring excellence. I actually just this year have written a book where it's a takeoff. Since '73 was my best book, and I decided why not just rip off anybody who remembers '73, and it's a small group. I would actually do a book on the growth and development of nurse leaders. And it is not unlike the sort of phenomenological view of the first book, because what that book does is to replicate what is the leadership literature's three big phases of leadership. And that's leadership is personal. There's a whole literature on what you as a person have to be and do to personally be capable of leadership. I would say that two that I am most fond of is self-aware, because if you don't know your strengths and your limitations, you're in trouble. And persistent. I mean, I like all the rest of them, but I'm particularly fond of those two. But the whole leadership literature has said what the person has inside, the capabilities, by itself isn't just a way of talking about leadership. Leadership is also goal attainment. You can be as charismatic as possible, but if you work for an organization and you never achieve anything, have you been a leader? So leadership as goal attainment is, do you know how to even define problems and analyze them? Are you capable of interpersonal and communication effectiveness? Do you know something about resource development, certainly financial, but even more importantly, the development of people? But if you achieve today's goals, are you getting ready for the future? So the third big aspect of leadership is leadership as transformational. Do you have a grasp of complexity? Do you read enough broadly to sort of see where the world's going so that you have some sense of vision? Do you strive for excellence, to be the best in whatever you're doing? And do you know how to alter organizational realities? So in any event, my book is about those three sections, and that takes me to sort of the biggest part of my talk today. This is Dave Letterman's state. So I have my Angela's Top 10 Lessons Learned About Leadership. First of all, leadership really equals full career development. You don't know how revolutionary that is, because in my field, when when so many people in my field stopped working when they got married and had children, they may not have come back into the workforce again until the children were launched. So they came back to entry-level jobs. They never were, over the course of a career, having a career so that you could change over a career. I think you only really exert leadership if, in fact, you're in there for the overtime. And for me, there are 5 stages of leadership. First one is obvious, and that's preparation. And that's not just formal education, but socialization experiences. The second stage of leadership is the stage of independent contributions. You know how to work with independently and interdependently with your colleagues to achieve professional expectations and outcomes. You work well yourself, and then you get into that third stage of starting to take more and more responsibility for developing the home setting, building the infrastructure, the resources, and the image of your home setting. That kicks you into the fourth stage, which is development of your field. Now you leave the confines of your home setting, perhaps to be very involved in professional associations, and through that kind of work to actually make bigger change. That's the time when you're advancing your profession to achieve the public good. And then my favorite, of course, stage is the current one, which is the Gadfly Period. And if you've ever read Plato's Republic, he actually talks about the gadfly as the truth seeker, the person who asked questions that maybe other people cannot. I happen to think that the Gadfly period of a career is when you are free, she said, giving this talk, to be creatively provocative. When you're no longer in harness. You know, people, when I was dean, couldn't tell the difference between Angela and the dean. People really don't want a particularly opinionated dean. They want a facilitative dean. So if you have sharper edges in your mind, there may be some difference between the main role that you're playing and, in fact, some of the issues that you would really personally to go off on. So I think this is the fifth period is when you are free of institutional responsibilities and yet still active in your professional life. My second lesson learned is that mentors are important at each career stage, and you need to be one at each stage. If you actually, again, go back to the literature, and Daniel Levinson wrote the first book on becoming your own person, talking about adult development, and he talked for men that actually there was a period where he called boom, becoming your own man. And that's when you didn't need the mentor anymore and you went off. I would say one of the things that the women's movement has done is to say, particularly for women's lives, it doesn't work that way. Women don't really aspire to become their own person so much as they want to move in different areas, and they would like all the help that they can get as they move in different areas. But I think now we realize that it isn't like you have one mentor, but no matter what you're doing, you need a mentor. So in the preparation phase, you need somebody who models values and helps you set career goals. In the stage of independent contributions, you need someone who helps you navigate the inner workings of your institution or your profession and keeps you focused on what are the current benchmarks of success in your institution. When you're in the stage where you're developing the home setting, what you need help with is, I find, knowing how to delegate. Too often people go into the stage of facilitating the home setting and they don't let go of any of the responsibilities they did before. And then they get overwhelmed because they don't know really how to handle all that they're doing in the home setting. I think you also, at that stage, particularly need even additional help with how to develop your own mentoring abilities. I think when you're developing your field, you need somebody that you can talk to about strategies and future scenarios as you go on different boards. I've done this when I was on the board for the National Institute of Mental Health. I talked to a colleague who was rotating off just to get a sense of what were the issues, what were the demand characteristics of that particular board. The person was very helpful to me. And I think in the Gadfly period, you need somebody to help you envision post-institutional retirement opportunities. Or to put it another way, there's a whole bunch of us that really don't ever want to clean out our closets. Or if we take one big trip, we don't want to stay in perpetual motion. That what we want at this period is actually more wiggle room, but the ability to exert influence in our own field still. The third lesson learned is that you need to take responsibility for sustaining your own career optimism at every stage. I used to think that you were either optimistic or not. I mean, I sort of thought, well, there are optimistic people, and no matter what I looked like on the outside, I wasn't really sure I fell in that group. But one of the things that I have learned over time is that you cannot be effective working with other people if you don't take responsibility for sustaining your own career optimism. I think this means paying attention to all the things. In my own field, nurses are very good about telling you what to do, and they think they don't have to do any of those things themselves. And realizing that actually you best do it, because there's nothing worse than a leader who is going downhill quick. It doesn't inspire confidence. If you read the literature, some of what inspires career optimism are what I call the 4 C's of hardiness. People tend to be hardy, and that in itself generates career optimism if they're committed to what they do. They really believe in what they're doing. Secondly, if they believe that they can actually make a difference, they can control some things. You can't control everything. But life isn't just mercurial. There are things that you can do something about. The third is regarding change as offering opportunities. Change doesn't automatically mean bad stuff. People are hardier if they actually think that there could be an opportunity hiding there. And finally, staying connected to community. And I've always thought that that really was community on 2 kinds of community. One is the community of friendship and in your own locale, but it's also the community that you have in your own profession. I think one of the most important things about sustaining career optimism, particularly for women, is being careful about how you think about matters. There's a whole literature that talks about if you overgeneralize. I mean, if you say to yourself, I'm a lousy mother, I'm a lousy researcher, I was never meant to be a writer. So you make this blanket statement. What you really mean is that last Tuesday at 4 o'clock, you were not swift. Now, I'm here to tell you we are all we have the right not to be swift all the time. So it is much better, and I'm talking about what goes inside your head, not so much even when you're talking to other people. It is much better to say, I was not swift last Tuesday, because you can actually take care of that. And now that you've thought about it, you can do something different than to overgeneralize. Ruminating, confronting your irrational beliefs that everybody will love you, you can be perfect at all times, you can be... we still have those normal crazy thoughts. They're normal because everybody's got them, but they're crazy because they don't make any sense and they just drive us crazy. One of the things that I had to confront, and many of you know, the first 12 and a half years I was at IUPUI, I had a house in Lafayette and I worked here at IUPUI. So it was 125 miles round trip. And my dear husband, when I came home, he would be good enough to say, "How was your day?" And I would just go on. I would never talk about anything neutral. And if it was positive, I tended to take it for granted. And so there would be the one or two things that I thought were negative about the day that I'd start talking about. And there came a time, we have 2 daughters, where I had to really confront the fact that they must wonder why I ever leave home. Because when I came home, I never said anything. I never said, "I was brilliant today. You should have seen me at this meeting. They said this, and I did this, and I got my way." But I didn't do that because I was raised not to have a big head, humility. Sometimes that means that you don't have a head. And then finally, I think sustaining career optimism means that you have to manage your anger. One of the most interesting facets of my book on the growth and development of nurse leaders is that I do have a chapter on sustaining career optimism and managing anger. All men to date who have looked at that outline have said, "What do you mean managing anger?" All women have said to me, "I'm going to read that chapter." And I have come to believe if you're a woman, if you're a minority, if you're a nurse, there's going to be a lot of anger. There's a lot of times when the larger society doesn't see you. So that nurses, every time people talk only about the School of Medicine, and I once said to Jerry Bepko, I figured it out, they're 14 times bigger than us, so every 15 times you have to mention the School of Nursing. But there are oftentimes also that women historically, minorities in our society, we still think white. And so we don't think. Maybe we don't do horrible things, but it's like Catholicism said, they're the sins of omission and the sins of commission. And what happens if you are not part of the larger society, that most of the leadership is all white male? Then in fact, they think a certain way. And so there are sins of omission because they never even see your point of view. The trouble is, if you're exerting leadership, you need to be strategic. And if you're angry all the time, that's a problem. And so managing anger becomes an important component of sustaining career optimism. You need to know, in my top 10, your strengths and your limitations. You want to build on and extend your strengths. And you really want to make friends with colleagues who like to do what you're not good at or you don't want to do. It took me longer than it should have to realize that some of the things I didn't like to do or wasn't good at, and often they went together, other people actually were good in that area. And see, again, I grew up with a notion of leadership that was really much more, it was removed from me. And so my notion of leadership was, if you couldn't be all things to all people, how much of a leader were you? And it took me more time, again, than it should have, to realize that exerting leadership isn't doing everything yourself. It's making sure, though, that the important matters get addressed. I regret that I wasn't as good. Now, if I were dean again, I would really ask people and say, you know you're not good at this, so what are you doing to manage what you're not good at? Because everybody who reports to you has something they're not good at themselves, and part of your responsibility is to help them figure out not how to get that goodness themselves, because they're good in something else that you need in your organization, so why try to change them? But to work with them to try to figure out how they actually can also work with people to have them maximize their strengths and then cover what you personally are not good at. Leading the full life means that you're always doing triage. Triage is a term in an emergency room where you try to figure out who's going to die soon and who's bleeding the most, and give them care first. There is, I used to think it was only times of crisis. You know, if you lead a full life, every day is a day of crisis. So you have to prioritize. I love Covey and his 7 lessons where he talks about what's critical and what's important. He says, of course, if it's important and critical, you've got to attend to it. What you really want to do, because the future is created that way, is work on what's not critical but important. If it's not important and not critical, why are you doing it? And if it is critical but you don't think it's important, it means it's somebody else's problem and they're trying to make it your own. And to somehow think through where your time goes. But see, for me, I thought girls were responsive, women were responsive, nurses were responsive, which means you respond to everybody's need, which means you are not being particularly strategic. So for me, getting the ability to be strategic was part of my own growth and development. When I work with people now, I say yes loudly and no softly, because you want to set priorities, but you want to have people think that you are a good worker in this institution. And when you say no, you want to be sure to pass on those opportunities to other people, because there's always somebody that this is something more and you don't need more of this, but somebody else needs that experience to move on themselves. Feedback is important to success. I hate it. I know it's good for me. You know, I know a good leader says, so okay, tell me what you think of this document. The trouble is you ask bright people for feedback and they give it to you. And you really did not want it because you are tired. You want that article to get out and in the mail. You don't want to rewrite it one more time. I have to tell you, when I was a dean, I remember at the end of a day saying to someone who was an associate dean, you know, what do you think of something? That person said to me what she thought, and I started arguing with her. I argued with her because I was done with the project. And what I wanted her to say was, this is the incarnation of perfection as we know it. And she did not say this. The next day when I came to my office, I actually went to her office and apologized, because I knew all you need is to ask people for feedback. They give it to you. You argue with them. They will never give you feedback again. But if you're going off a cliff, you want your colleagues to say, honey, come on back. I do know that projects always get better with feedback. I think you have to remember how to accept it graciously and then see what makes sense. One of the biggest things of leadership is how to give feedback in an ego-enhancing way to other people so that you're clear, you're specific, you're considerate, and you emphasize learning, not smartness. There's a lot of literature right now that says too much of the feedback is a got you, like, ha-ha, gotcha. And what that doesn't do is make anybody grow. Gotchas don't grow. I was fortunate. I had a chair for my dissertation committee when I was working on my doctorate who always implied, you're destined for greatness, but there are these 57 things you're going to have to do along the way. And in fact, she would regularly say, as you and I both know, and she would then say something tough. And I didn't know. But I liked her style because it sort of implied that I was smart enough that I probably already knew what problems I had. And I have tried to do that with people because it seems to me the more you give feedback that acknowledges that people already are now analyzing themselves, that in fact it then becomes much more useful to people. My 7th lesson is be values-driven. I have found that leaders need to stay on message for others to hear the message, and the more the message is values-oriented. One of the things I like about IU Health is that we regularly have a list of values, and they're not a piece of paper. We actually go back, and in fact, because Judge Sara Evans Barker chairs our values committee, she regularly says, but have we gone over the values for this partnership? Will this work? Because if we don't share values, the partnership is not going to work. I think the more you connect actions to values, the more you help others see the big picture. And the more you connect actions to values, the more you do not get waylaid by distractions. Because there's something really meaty about values, and people then don't get distracted as much. One of the biggest things that smart people need to know is that there really is a big difference between knowing what to do and getting things done. I think the more education you have, the more you think that somehow the key is knowing what to do. You need a good education to know what to do, but all the rest of life is, now that you know what to do, how to get it done, which means knowing where other people are coming from. Getting things done means that you cannot just tell people what to do, but have to help them understand why the next steps are necessary. I have come to believe that one of the biggest things that leaders do is sense-making for the organization. They talk about why we need to go in a certain direction, and they do it making sense of why at this point is this important. I think informatics is a good example of this. If you look in the whole healthcare industry, you could get every day upset with the 53 new things you need to know to be digitally correct. If you just saw it only as another technique, another technology, but if you don't understand the bigger picture, like of the electronic health record, we're not there yet, but the really big picture of an electronic health record is that all knowledge will be in the same place, and you and the people taking care of you will have access. And that way you don't lose things so much. You can keep track of things. The chances that you'd be on 27 drugs and they'd all fight with each other and you'd be depressed as a result of that is less likely to happen. So the more you don't just talk about actions, but you talk about the overall reason you need to move in a direction, for me is an important part of sense-making. Policy-making and anything else that is important doesn't belong to any one discipline or one field, so you've got to be interdisciplinary. Leaders, by definition, are boundary spanners. They go across departments, they go across schools, they go across different pieces. You want to, therefore, if you're going to exert leadership, participate in interdisciplinary forums, join interdisciplinary groups, publish in interdisciplinary journals. That to me means that you need to read broadly and work with others who conceptualize the world differently than you do to have a good sense of future trends. And then I think my 10th lesson is you need to practice gratitude and appreciation. First of all, the more people appreciate you, the more you reflect on all the good things in your life, the more optimistic you're going to be. There's a whole literature that proves this. And I think the threads of connection, otherwise known as networking, and that's anything from thank you notes to a whole array of letters of recommendation, favors done and received, enable you to operate beyond your own limitation, because every thread of connection you have with every student, with every colleague, with everyone at another place, it's not tit for tat, but it all is there as sort of a richness that you can tap into. One of the best parts about getting older is you really understand that what you know is this big, but if you are connected to lots of people, I always say to myself, I can answer any question in nursing with 2 phone calls. What I know is this big, but I either know who knows, or I know who will tell me who to call up, who really knows. So that's not 6 degrees of separation. That's 2 phone calls. And I feel pretty proud of myself. It's sort of like I'm pretty hot stuff. I have this golden Rolodex. And the nice part about that is whatever you wind up doing, and you've worked with people, there are possibilities that are not just limited by in fact, what you can do. Leadership isn't just winning honors yourself, it's also making sure that you appreciate others and help others to, in fact, get recognized. One of the things that I try to do as dean, particularly, was to nominate people for as many things as I thought that they could be nominated for. And I actually had a number of colleagues say to me, oh, this doesn't matter to me. And, I would say in the words of Rhett Butler, my dear, I really don't care if this matters to you. Our reputation gets better every time somebody wins an honor. So I am going to nominate you for it. Now, I never nominated anyone for anything where I didn't think they had a 51% chance, because I think there needs to be a pretty good chance to go in. Anyway, for me, when I think of appreciation, I think of my family, and this is my whole family here. From left to right, Lei Jung, who is my older daughter's husband. He has a doctorate in educational psychology and is a professor and actually chair of the Department of Educational Psychology at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. The handsome chap to his left is my grandson, who's about to be 16 in a couple weeks. He's 6'1" now and a growing boy. In front of him is his sister Claire, who is about to be 13. And she actually can take photographs of anybody secretly, and they turn up in movies. And so I think the CIA needs to actually grab her. Her mom is to her left, our older daughter, Catherine. She has a doctorate in developmental psychology and teaches at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. The occasion here is the marriage of our younger daughter. So to the left of Cammie is her new brother-in-law, Joe, who is a lawyer in St. Louis. To his left is our daughter, Kara, who teaches Spanish at St. Louis University. And then me and my husband. In the audience, these are 3 out of the 4 people here are in the audience, and I do aquasize with them in the morning at the YMCA. And I have to tell you, everything they say in the literature about social networks is really important, because aquasize not only keeps the arthritis at bay, but you can also say, I need a new roof. Who am I going to get a bid from? Did you have anybody who actually did anything? I want to recognize 2 people who have been particularly important in my life as mentors. Rita Duma was my first department chair when I was at Yale. She then went on to be deputy director at NIMH, and she was the dean of nursing at the University of Michigan. She's no longer with us, but everyone here probably knows Doris Merritt, the wonderful Doris Merritt, who was the first dean of research at IUPUI, many other distinctions. I love the fact that she has awards in the School of Medicine. There's an endowed lectureship in her name. In engineering, there is an award, and in nursing, because she was the first acting director of the National Center for Nursing Research. These are some of my colleagues elsewhere, and this is an occasion of our first 20 years of doctoral students, many of whom then have gone on to be on our faculty. And Joan is in the audience, and you can see Joan. Ann Belcher is in the audience, and you can see Ann Belcher. I'm just going to end my remarks, because I've done a lot of looking backwards. But it's really important to look at what you've learned to move forward. And I have to tell you that my generation in nursing, that's a half century, was largely responsible for infrastructure development. We had to figure out, having the old scripts in our head, how to actually be leaders in the 21st century. Now, I am pleased to tell you that we have done such a good job that the Institute of Medicine, which was created by the United States Congress to do health policy for our country, has actually said that nurse leadership is terribly important. So the 2004 IOM report on keeping patients safe says you need nurses to exert transformational leadership so, in fact, we can have safe environments in healthcare, that they are the key to quality and safety. And just in the last 6 months, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation supported a study on the future of nursing, which also very much emphasizes more educated nurses, nurses being full partners with physicians and other healthcare professionals in redesigning and leading healthcare change. So for me, I think my looking back is to really think about leadership in the 21st century. So for me, the new equation is nurse equals leader. It isn't unusual. It's like woman equals leader. It's not surprising. It is a given. Leadership does not equal administration. Being an administrator doesn't guarantee leadership. You don't need to exert leadership. You can exert leadership without being an administrator. I think we have much more understanding of the leadership journey now than ever before. And one of the things that I am most pleased to have played a part in is that we increasingly have programs that nurture leadership across a career, so that, in fact, right now I chair the National Advisory Committee for the Robert Wood Johnson's Nurse Faculty Scholar Program. They also have an executive nurse program. I'm on the board for their health policy program, which is interdisciplinary leadership. And I personally have been very involved with the Hartford Foundation's Building Academic Geriatric Nursing Program. All of these are helping people so it doesn't take them 50 years to learn the 10 lessons that I have learned along the way. And I end with a poem. Career resume lines, but more than a long list. What's core is the sum total of meaning. Mentored, then mentoring. The challenge is to give away self as you build substance in place. Thank you for letting me give my penultimate lecture.